Okay, so it's been my practice for the last few years to try to conduct international observations as part of IOTA public outreach, as well as to try to actually conduct some actual scientific observations. So these are my two international attempts this year. It's been somewhat of a challenge trying to do this on Social Security and frequent flyer miles, but I've done it. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. I went through a number of different possible considerations, including Steve's list, looking at the very brightest international events that might be selected, those that have good past statistics according to Steve's site, and also those that had my own personal interest involved. Next slide, please. So the first one had to do with the asteroid 41 Daphne and the bright star HIP 93026, which is obviously known by everyone. This event is a slightly brighter than fifth magnitude star and occurred on March 31st. I chose a location called Nicoya Island, and I'll explain why I did that, in Indonesia. This particular event had a potential duration of nearly 10 seconds and also a magnitude drop that was quite severe, so there was no question that there was going to be an occultation. I'd either see it or I wouldn't. Next slide, please. So this is the path, and you can see that from this very tight error bars that the probability of seeing a miss was really pretty low. And however, what's probably not so obvious is the fact that this is probably the only part of the world to actually see it, even though the path stretched far to the east. And that was mainly due to lighting conditions as well as altitude considerations. But getting here was somewhat of an interesting challenge. Next slide, please. Forget some of these lines, but the yellow line shows the route that I took from Houston to Chicago, over to Tokyo, and then Hong Kong, and then finally to Singapore. Next slide, please. And from Singapore, the idea was to get to this little tiny island, which is located at the end of the second arrow. You'll see an arrow running from Singapore itself over to a port on Bintan Island, which is that fairly large white area. I had to take a ferry for that one, and then by land along the shorter arrow to another location where I had to take a motorboat over to Nicoya Island. Next slide, please. So this is what the island looks like. It's about a half a mile in diameter, pretty small, and essentially it's a resort hotel that has a number of bungalows along the beach. So this is my kind of place. I'm you know, not following David's example of going to Travel Lodge or Days Inn. I wanted to go to a place that actually had room service and, you know, had some interesting things to see. And in essence, I got a little bit more than I bargained for. But you can see the island is so small that it really didn't mandate the ability to set up multiple stations. So that was one unfortunate aspect of this particular trip, and I'll discuss more about how we decided to do something a little different later. Next slide, please. So here I am on the ferry. This is from Singapore over to Bintan. What's interesting is that not too long after the trip, there was a major prison break on Bintan Island, and all the ferries were shut down, and they were looking for escapees. And luckily, that didn't happen when we were going over and back. Next slide, please. And by the way, on this slide, you can see the equipment that I carried in my briefcase. This is the portable video stuff. So going to Bintan Island, you see these typical. Okay, well, there's the briefcase. It contains essentially a mighty mini. Can you go back there one more time? Sorry. Okay, it contains a mighty mini setup, camcorder, GPS, and everything else that I needed for the expedition. No clothes, that was in a separate bag, but this is pretty much the standard fare that we use when I at least travel by air and carry everything in a small briefcase for one mighty mini site. Next slide, please. So on Bintan Island, everything is pretty much non-English. The satellite dish, you can see, points straight up because it proves that you're really at the equator where all the communication satellites are located. The big exclamation point is a total mystery to me, but it was interesting, so it must have something to do with occultation observing. I don't know what it was. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the strange habits that local islanders have on Nicoya Island is to put spiders on their face. And I had to take a picture of this because this usually doesn't happen in other expeditions, especially in this country. You normally step on the spiders, but here they have their own methods of dealing with insects. Next slide, please.
What was the spider's name?
He actually had a name, and the guy who actually had the spider on his face really saved me because he was the one who had all the electrical knowledge on the island, and I had left a critical plug behind, if he hasn't. And he was able to scrounge and create a plug that allowed me to power my equipment. Okay, so also on the island, you see these telltale tracks. And they're not snakes, and they're not lizards, they are Komodo dragons, or their equivalent. So you got to be careful. You see little paw prints, those aren't dogs or cats. Next slide, please. So here's a site that I found. I knew this was going to be easy to set up. It was actually a fabulous resort. There was nobody out there at night, and the Mighty Mini sits here on a standard Walmart tripod, and is ready to go. This is just a test in the afternoon to set it up at the elevation and azimuth for which I knew the star to be. Next slide, please. All right, so this is what you have to be on the lookout for, and at night you really don't want to be running into these things, even though they're typically not carnivorous, although they do eat small rodents. If they're provoked, they can take certain actions that would be unfortunate. So we have to be very careful. Next slide. I think it was about a quarter-mile walk from our bungalow, which is this is the top floor of our bungalow. It was well above the ground level. This is a really nice place. They didn't have air conditioning. They had fans. But if you ever have a chance to go to this location, it's well worth your time. Next slide, please. Now this is a view from the beach. Literally, we were right on the beach. Next slide. And this is a view out into the water. I had considered setting up out on the sand, but the ground was really too unstable, so we had to go down again about a quarter mile to the location that I showed you earlier. Next slide, please. Just to let you know, this is not, again, Travel Lodge or Comfort Inn or Days Inn. They have really wonderful food, and it's the kind of food that you can eat. And for Westerners, I was really pleased to see things like orange juice and scrambled eggs and stuff like that. Excellent. Next slide. All right, so here is Yogi. He is the guy who had the spider on his face, and you see this long cable that he erected. There was actually a 220-volt plug that he had set up on this area near the pool, which is the far end of the complex, and he was able to rig up a plug which plugged in there and also plugged into my equipment, so we could get power to the camera and the camcorder. Next slide, please. So here we are just before the start of the observation. The briefcase is open, and I'm actually looking at the camcorder screen. The telescope is set up, and it's got a small light shield around it. Next slide. No, this is not a Canadian. expedition. So after the event, we went back to Singapore and met with Albert Lim. Albert was my contact at the Singapore Astronomical Society, and he had attempted to gather observers in Singapore itself, which is just south of the northern limit. And I had also made contact with an observer in Malaysia, and so we hoped to have 4 or 5 stations. In reality, we only had one, and that was at Albert's Observatory. But after the event, we had dinner and were able to meet and talk about it. Next slide, please. And this is sort of a general indication that even astronomical societies that don't have active observing occultation sections can support events like this. So here's the result of the observation. My chord is chord number 1, which is that red line that fits exactly with the ISAM model at the phase angle for Daphne. And the green line is, I think, the center of the prediction, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe it's the dash line. I keep forgetting what this is. But anyway, my observation worked well. It's another example of why we use video instead of visual observations, and that's obviously to keep the level of accuracy quite high. I'm sorry. The blue line is Albert Lim's observation in Singapore, and the dotted line is the predicted center. So his observation, also made with GPS time-inserted video, and mine agree precisely with the model. And this is just one of the more happy things that we as occultation observers look forward to. Obviously, it would have been great to have 5 or 6 or 10 more chords, but we just didn't have that luxury given the terrain as well as the clouds. What I probably didn't specify is that the level of clouds at my site came up to an elevation of 15 degrees above the horizon, and the elevation of the star was 16 degrees. So I barely made it, but even so, the star was bright enough to where, even with a thin cloud, I probably would have seen it, even if the cloud had moved up a bit higher. So I wanted you to see this as an example of what we can do, not only domestically, but internationally. Next slide, please. Okay, so then we have Philomela, which just occurred on 9/11. This particular event involved a 7.1 magnitude star called HIP 2038, and its elevation was about 26 degrees above the southwestern sky, and obviously it was a lot fainter than the other star, but I was confident that we could see it. It had a significant magnitude drop and a substantial duration of disappearance. Next slide, please. The problem with this is it occurred in an area that I've always wanted to go to. I could have gone to Turkey because you can see the path, and by the way, the path you see does have very low error bars here. The path does go over Georgia, and it goes over South Ossetia. So Sochi, which is the point of the red line, is actually my destination and the jumping off point for where I was hoping to get to South Ossetia. Next slide. Okay, well that's not good. Let's go to the next slide. All right, it must have fallen off. Okay, so then on arrival in Sochi, I encountered what I call unexpected problems. I've been working with a travel agency in Moscow to try to coordinate my hotel and ground arrangements, and through quite a series of errors, I was never able to transfer money to this agency. The bank transfer didn't work. There was problems with that, and they said, well, don't worry, you can pay when you get to Sochi. I said, fantastic. But then in the last 2 weeks prior to the expedition, the email traffic with them just went to 0. I could never get a response from them. They had a PayPal option on their site, but that never worked. And these people were advertising tours related to the upcoming Olympics, and they were one of the major travel agencies pushing this. So I figured, they got to be reliable, and no problem. When we got to the airport in Sochi at 3:30 in the morning, there was nobody there to meet us, and that pretty much was icing on the cake. I knew there was a problem. And the only 2 people in the airport that I could even talk to were female screeners who were checking people as they came in, and I asked them about the name of the hotel, and they said, oh, we never heard of this place. Another bad sign. And so one of the female screeners who spoke English directed me to the information desk, which is upstairs. So I went upstairs to the escalator, all the lights were out, and I found this one desk with information above it. And there's an old woman there who's probably in her 70s. She was asleep. And so I had to wake her up, and she was not very happy to be woken up. And so I asked her in Russian, because luckily I have a little bit of command of the Russian language. It's not great, but it's enough to get by. Where the hotel desk was, or where a particular hotel was located, and she said, oh, you have to go into town, because we have no information here. But here they are a number of months away from the Olympics, and they have no information on where people can stay or how to get there. Next slide, please. So you can see the Occultation expedition was in jeopardy. Okay, so the security person there, the screener, said she knew a taxi driver. So the rain was just coming down in buckets. And so a taxi driver arrives, and my wife and I get in the taxi, and immediately we head over to this hotel. And this the taxi driver is just speaking in Russian 90 miles an hour. And of course, I can't understand, I'm trying to tell him to slow down. And even when he does, he has this Texas accent translated to Russia that I still can't really understand very well. But we went to about 5 different hotels until finally, after an hour, we found a hotel that actually had a room. And so this was a rather difficult situation. At least we had a place to stay. So I figured hopefully overnight, and the next day I could figure this out. Next slide, please. So here's this interesting hotel. This is a view out of our, actually off the front of the hotel property onto the Black Sea. The next morning, it was after we slept for hours. Actually, it was the same morning because we actually got to the hotel about 4:30. And so about 8 or 9 o'clock, this is the way it was. Beautiful location, right on the equivalent of the Coney Island boardwalk before it was destroyed. Next slide, please. So I went out looking for potential sites. This was after I figured out that it might be very unlikely to get to South Ossetia. I had to consider a backup plan that was to observe from the Sochi area. And so this was a place along the beach near where we were staying with an observation platform to look out over the sea. So I figured that might be a good spot. Next slide, please. And of course, there were a lot of beachgoers, so it made it rather difficult. I had to wait for them to clear out, assuming that we were going to use this site. But the site was really perfect in terms of being able to access the star, except, of course, we were many, many tens of kilometers away from the edge of the path. But this was my initial backup plan. And when you're out observing, you really have to become creative as things go straight down. Next slide, please. So, well, these are just some of the Russian beachgoers, and trying to negotiate space on a beach is challenging. The Russians consider the beach to be a pretty wonderful place to go. It's about the only pastime they have. And here we are, it's in the 70s out there. It's really quite wonderful. And the beach is primarily rocks, but that's their beach. Next slide. So out there, okay, let me digress and move forward. So I tried to arrange transportation to South Ossetia, which proved to be almost totally impossible. So instead, I tried to get as close to the path that I could. So I was able to get on transport to Abkhazia, which is essentially a piece of Georgia that Russia carved out and turned into a separate independent republic. So here we are in Abkhazia at a small lake, and there's a telescope, which I thought would be pretty cool to use for an occultation, but they use it here to watch people climbing a mountain way off in the distance. So I figured I'd take a picture of this anyway. Next slide, please. So when you're out looking for food, you have to take advantage of the pictures. Sometimes the pictures are interesting, sometimes they're not. So, you know, at 30 rubles to $1, this is like $5 for almost anything you could get. And the food there was not that bad. It was actually fairly decent if you got it cooked. Next slide, please. And of course, the standard staple that I use is the Coke Zero, and finding a Coke Zero in Sochi or Abkhazia is almost impossible. So the closest I could get to was a Coke, which my wife liked, and Coca-Cola Light, which was a good substitute. Next slide. Okay, so here's where the plan was. The plan was to go from Sochi up on the top to the right. And by the way, this is the diagram provided by the travel agency in Moscow, over to a city called Vladikavkaz, and then to go by road south into that yellow area called South Ossetia. Well, if you look down there, you can see the word Georgia. The country of Georgia used to encompass both Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but the Russians had stirred up enough hornets with the local ethnic Russian population in South Ossetia where they had a war there not too long ago. And Abkhazia essentially is not part of Georgia anymore either. It's literally a separate country with Russian customs posts along the way. So the challenge was how we're going to get to the center line, which is essentially close to that yellow area, or in that yellow area, given the conditions that I was facing. So right now, the closest that I figured I could get would be to the point here just above the letter K in Abkhazia, which was nearly to the edge of the path, the northern limit. Next slide. So again, this was the planned observation point in South Ossetia near a little village called Zaw, and the travel agency even laid this out, a nice little map in traditional historic times. This is called the Republic of Kusar-Irisan, even before it was called South Ossetia. So they like to use these historical maps because they don't recognize current maps. They like to stick to the past. Let's go forward again. One thing to note about Georgia is the town of Gori in Georgia is actually the birthplace of Joseph Stalin. And there's a big movement afoot to restore as many statues of Stalin now that were all torn down after the fall of the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. Okay, so the idea was how do I get to as close to the path as I could. Next slide. Okay, so in order to get from one place to another, you had to encounter certain things like high pressure hoses. These are things that people, I don't know, it's a Russian custom, and they blast high powered hoses on you at different places. This is one that I've seen on the beach, but there are other places along the way where you encounter these particular devices like crude torture chambers on the way from point A to point B. Next. They get the sand off, but they also soak you good. You also have monkeys that terrorize unsuspecting passers-by. This is a guy who nearly had his shorts ripped off by this particular monkey. This is true. This is not made up. Next slide. And then you have to go by an underground train to a cave. Next slide. And then you have to cross this perilous bridge about 150 feet below the ground. And this is on the way to the Occultation path. I'm not fooling you. Keep going. Next slide, please. And that just shows you where I'm at. This is the Novo Afonskaya cave in the town of Sukhum, which is also called Sukhumi. It's the so-called capital of Abkhazia. Next slide. And so here again is a little bit of an issue. You can see that Sukhum is pretty far from the northern limit, but it was about as close as I could get. But this was essentially where I ended up trying to observe the occultation. Next slide. And this is another map that kind of shows the political construction of what used to be Georgia, how Abkhazia split off, and the location of South Ossetia, which would have been the location of my observation site had I been able to get there. Next slide. This represents some of the problems that they have in Abkhazia. this area is occupied by different ethnic minorities, Abkhazians, Armenians, Georgians, and as a result, it doesn't take much for many wars to get started. So it's actually pretty risky to travel in this area, and it's expected that Chechen terrorists are going to be using this route to get into Sochi to disrupt the Olympics this coming year. So we have to sort of keep this in mind, but there wasn't much we could do about it. You can see this border between Georgia on the right and Abkhazia is completely closed and occupied by Russian troops. Next slide. Okay, so essentially I had clear sky in Sochi. I was hoping to observe from Sukhum actually, and they told me that we were not allowed to observe it. Apparently there is some law that they have, or at least that's what they said, that prevents using telescopes at night. That was my interpretation of how they translated it. So they essentially told us to go back to Russia. So my wife and I went back as we were instructed, and the only place I could observe was, again in Sochi, which was very far from the path. I can confirm that there was no secondary events. It was occultation. Next slide, if there is one. There we go. So, one of the lessons that I think we all learn every time we conduct an expedition, that even if you do everything right, sometimes things don't go the way you intended them. So, that's the end of my presentation. Questions?